Hello, and welcome everybody to the National Trends in Disability Employment,
or nTIDE,
Lunch and Learn series.
Just a few housekeeping items before we begin.
This webinar is being recorded.
We will post an archive of each webinar each month on our website at www.researchondisability.org/nTIDE.
This site will also provide copies of the presentations, the speakers' bios, full transcripts, and other valuable resources.
As an attendee of this webinar, you are a viewer.
To ask questions of the speakers, click on the Q&A box on your webinar screen and type your questions into the box.
Speakers will review these questions and provide answers during the last section of the webinar.
Some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A box.
If you have any questions following this recording, please contact us at disability.statistics@unh.edu
or toll free at 866-538-9521 for more information.
Thanks for joining us.
Enjoy today's webinar.
Welcome, everyone. This is Deb Brucker from the University of New Hampshire's Institute on Disability. Next slide, please, Karen. The National Trends in Disability Employment Lunch and Learn occurs at noon Eastern on the day that the nTIDE report is released. It's a joint effort of the UNH Institute on Disability, Kessler Foundation, and the Association of University Centers on Disability. The Lunch and Learn is part of the Rehabilitation and Research Training Center on Employment Policy and Measurement, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, NIDE. Next slide. So our agenda today, we will start with our monthly report of the employment and labor force participation numbers. John O'Neill will provide an introduction from the Kessler Foundation, and then I'll provide the data from today. Our next part is nTIDE News. Denise Rozelle from the Association of University Centers on Disabilities will provide news from the field. And we're excited for part 3 to have our guest speaker be Sally Rogers, the Executive Director and Research Professor of the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation in Boston University, to talk about vocational rehabilitation supports for persons with psychiatric disabilities. And as a reminder, we'll have Q&A for all parts of our program at the end of our webinar, and you can use the chat box to post any questions at any time during this program. Next slide.
Good day, everybody. This is John O'Neill. I'm going to introduce the nTIDE report. It's a monthly report, and it is a press release with an infographic that looks at the latest employment statistics. It uses data from the jobs report released by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics on the first Friday of each month, and it's a joint effort of the Kessler Foundation and the University of New Hampshire. Next slide, please. The source of the data, it's, as I mentioned, it's the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics that provides it, and it's the current population survey. It's actually the source of the official unemployment rate, which everyone makes so much of. It is a survey of civilians between the ages, or our data at least, is it looks at civilians ages 16 through 64 not living in institutions. And it's been available since 2008 onward, when the 6 disability questions were added to the federal surveys by the Census Bureau. The data, we report on the employment to population ratio, which is a key indicator that reflects the percentage of people who are working relative to the total population. We also report on the labor force participation rate, which is the percentage of the population that is working or actively looking for work. And the percent of those looking for work actually constitutes the unemployment rate, which we do not report out on. This data is not yet seasonally adjusted, which is why we compare the current information to the same month last year. Next slide. And back to you, Deb.
Thanks, John. Next slide. So we saw an increase. On the left are the rates of the employment to population ratio for people with disabilities, increased 1 percentage point from this time last year to 31.4%, up 3.3%. People without disabilities, shown on the right, increased up 0.2 percentage points to 74% from the same time last year, or up 0.3%. Next slide. The labor force participation rate, as John mentioned, includes people that are working or people that are actively looking for work. And again, this rate has gone up for people with disabilities compared to this time last year, up 1 percentage point to 34.1%, or up 3.0%. And it's actually decreased a little bit for people without disabilities to 76.6%, down 0.3 percentage points, or down 0.4%. Next slide. This slide shows the trend in the employment to population ratio for people with and without disabilities starting in 2008. As John mentioned, that was the first time we had consistent measures of disability included in this survey. So you can see that there's been a significant gap all along, but both the rates for people with and without disabilities were fairly high in 2008 and then had a dip after the recession. And people with disabilities are slowly gaining ground to their pre-recession levels, although they're not there yet, whereas people without disabilities have regained the ground that they had lost during the recession. Next slide. So we'd like to invite you to take a poll. If you're joining via Zoom, we'll soon have a pop-up poll that you can see. If you're joining via Facebook Live, you can use the chat function that's available and type in your response. We're asking, what topics would you like to have discussed in an upcoming Lunch and Learn webinar? Long-term services and supports, veterans and employment, youth transition, disability and poverty, technology, media and the arts, research and training, business and employment, advocacy, and health and benefit planning. You can choose one or all of any of these that are of interest to you, and we will try to put this in a rotation in our monthly webinars. So I'll just give you a minute or so to participate in the poll, and then we can share the results right during our webinar. Thank you everyone who voted. We can see, I'm not sure if this poll results from Zoom shows up on our Facebook Live page. It looks like the winners were long-term services and supports, youth transition, disability and poverty had the most votes that I can see. So we'll close that poll, and we'll also have a record of that we can refer back to later. Thank you. Next slide. So I'll turn this over to Denise Rozelle for nTIDE News.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I want to echo what Deb just said. We really appreciate you taking the poll, and should there be something that you want to hear about that wasn't up on the poll, or you can add it to the chat box if you're watching through Zoom, or again, get us that information, because we are beginning to plan for next year, and we'd like to make sure that we have people that are what you're interested in hearing about. It also influences what I do in the nTIDE, in the news section that we're going to be talking about now. although obviously the things that are happening in the news influence that as well. Okay, so next slide, please. Oh, federal policy. So we always do a quick update, sometimes quicker than others, about federal policy. I want you to know that the 2019 appropriations are finished for most of the programs that we care about. That is the Health and Human Services programs, the Department of Education programs, Department of Labor. All of those have passed both houses of Congress and was signed by the president. As you know, that is a continual process, so we'll start talking about 2020 appropriations come the beginning of next year. But for now, for those of you who are waiting to hear, it actually was pretty darn close to the October 1st deadline. And actually, he might have even signed it before October 1st. The other pieces of appropriations that have not yet passed, they'll continue to work on during a lame duck in all likelihood, and there's some continuing resolutions. So I had mentioned last time, and I'm going to mention again here, money follows the person continues to look like it may be taken up in the lame duck session for those of you who are interested in that. It looks like if it is, it will be only a 1-year extension, but 1-year extension is better than no extension at all. And there are some people who are fighting, and some members of Congress who are trying to get a 2-year extension. We'll see if that actually happens. But this is one of those where I would tell you to keep an eye out on your favorite advocacy group who's tracking it. AUCD, if you don't know anywhere else to go, we have stuff up on our policy site. And we'll see what happens, basically. There was a hearing recently where money follows was one of the topics in the hearing, but we're trying to see, we have some hope. There might actually be something that happens in the lame duck on that. The House of Representatives has now recessed until after the election. As anyone who's not been living under a rock knows, the Senate is still in, taking up the Kavanaugh nomination, among other things. But for right now, the House is gone until after the election, so nothing else is going to really be happening there. Now, and I assume those of you on this call probably know, when the legislature is not working, there are always other things going on. And in fact, we have a couple of regulatory things coming up that I want to make sure you're aware of. I'm going to take them in reverse order for what I have on the slide. The WIOA regulations, there has been a lot of talk ever since the spring that the WIOA regulations might be reopened, particularly to look at the definition of competitive integrated employment, particularly to look at issues around choice, issues around segregated work, issues around work crews, and the definitions. I think I said to you last month that my gut tells me that those regs are going to be open. We continue to hear, however, and I want to be really clear, we continue to hear that the decision has not yet been made by the Department of Education whether or not to open those regulations. So we continue to wait. That's really all I got on that one. Public charge. This is one that may be totally unfamiliar to those of you on the phone. It certainly was totally unfamiliar to me, but I think it's one that you need to be aware of. The draft changes in the regulations, we got an announcement about it last week. My understanding is they're going to be published in the Federal Register on the 10th, October 10th, and then they'll be open for comment. I do not know how long the comments will be open for. I will tell you again, AUCD will definitely have draft comments available. We will definitely have stuff up on our website. But let me tell you just a little bit about it. So public charge refers to the term that immigration officials use to talk about people who are considered primarily dependent on the government for their subsistence. If you are determined to be a public charge, then you can be denied admission to the U.S. You can also be denied lawful permanent resident status. So it affects people who are seeking to become green card holders. It affects individuals trying to immigrate lawfully to the U.S. And right now, current regulations say that you can apply, they look to determine whether or not you're a public charge. They look at things, cash assistance like SSI, TANF, and comparable state and local programs. They also look at government-funded long-term institutional care. The rules that are being proposed would add things to that, things that affect people that we serve, people with disabilities. So under the proposed rule, they are suggesting they would add non-emergency Medicaid to that. So if you are non-emergency Medicaid coverage, that could be considered public charge and keep you from lawful permanent resident status or deny admission to you to the United States. They have a request for comments in the draft regulations asking whether CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, should also be included in that. They would include SNAP, food stamps, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. They would include Medicare Part D low-income subsidies and housing assistance, which is another one that would affect us. Housing assistance like public housing or Section 8 housing vouchers. All of those things would be included in the definition of public charge and therefore could act against someone trying to either come to the country or to get lawful permanent resident status. As I said, I think this affects a lot of folks with disabilities who are in one of those two categories because of the housing issues, because of the SNAP, because of the Medicaid, and potentially because of CHIP. So I really urge you to go look at this. As I said, AUCD will have draft regulations. We have I think it's already up there, a one-pager that actually I was just reading from. It's a very simple, plain language version of what this means. And if this is something that affects people you serve, that you're interested in, I really would suggest you go find out more about it. Okay, next slide. Let's move on from federal policy. Speaking of homelessness and housing assistance and such, interesting study in August 2018 from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness that specifically focuses on people with disabilities. What they're doing is doing a series of reports that specifically look at a series of special subpopulations. So this one is the one around disability. 24% of all adults experiencing homelessness are people with disabilities. 10 to 15% of individuals who enter homelessness experience chronic homelessness. So, people enrolled in programs designed to provide housing and services for people with chronic homelessness have really high rates of chronic illness, physical disability, mental health and substance abuse disorders, and interestingly enough, more than I would have anticipated, significant numbers of people with developmental disabilities as well. Next slide. There we go. What was also interesting were some of the data gaps that they identified in the report related to people with disabilities, and for which we need more research and more analysis. And again, for people on this call, I thought this would be particularly interesting. Characteristics and needs of families with children, particularly where the head of the household has a disability. We need more research on that one. More on the risks and the protections that might help forecast which people with disabilities and their families with disabled heads of households are more likely to experience chronic homelessness. Again, to the extent we can look, no surprise to anybody on this call, maybe this is just beating a dead horse. To the extent we can find the risk factors and the things that will help, obviously we can then do a better job. How often people with disabilities are experiencing unsheltered homelessness? That would be hospitals, jail, and other kinds of, let me back up. How often people with disabilities experiencing unsheltered homelessness, that is people on the streets, actually stay in shelters, hospitals, treatment facilities, etc., because that also gives us the opportunity to figure out what kinds of interventions might actually work. So there are a variety of things here. I thought it was a fascinating study and thought you might be interested. Okay, next slide. I always pull out anything where I see something around working women with disabilities because I don't know that we look as carefully at the discrepancies or the differences between men and women and the stereotypes within the disability community. We tend to look at disability generally. So I thought this one was really interesting. There were some unique challenges due to the stereotypes, the intersectionality, if you will, of someone who has both disability and is female. And I thought that was interesting, and it gives some data around that one. No surprise that what we find, as with many people with disabilities, we find for women with disabilities that some of the strategies they use in employment are, proving that they're going the extra mile. They work even harder than their non-disabled coworkers just to prove that they are as capable. Well, when you think about, we see that in studies around gender, we see that in studies around disability generally. So when you put the two together, it makes sense that that's one of the findings. The thing about accommodation is the same thing. It's a double-edged sword. Do you reveal? Do you not? How do you make that determination? And some of the conversations that they had in doing these interviews, and these were primarily interviews, I thought were really interesting, is how people make those determinations. So I would recommend that one to you as well. Next slide. How does employment influence health outcomes? I thought this one was interesting because, and specifically in intellectual disability, I thought this one was interesting because it ties into some of the health outcomes data that we've been talking about. It even ties into some of the data that we talked about last month, where we talked about work and Medicaid. So it was a lit review on health and quality of life outcomes. Very clearly, very limited research in this area, another place where we could use a lot more research. It does show that a tenuous relationship does exist, but for those of you who are the research folks on the phone, you'll understand more what that means. But it does find that there are connections between these health outcomes and employment. And I frankly think the more we can show those from a policy standpoint, as you know, I'm kind of the policy geek, the more we can show that from a policy standpoint, the more that we can support both employment and better healthcare. So for people with disabilities. So I thought that was an interesting one as well. Next slide. A couple of webinars coming up. Again, I also am always pretty interested in seeing anything that is a cultural competence. So around cultural competence. So this is by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Minority Health, about community participation in research studies by Hispanic and Latino, folks in the Hispanic and Latino community, barriers to participation, how do we do better at that? What are some programs that are doing better at that? How do we share resources so we can better get the Latino community more involved in research studies? And there's some really good people. I didn't put the speakers on this slide, but there are some really good people from the Hispanic and Latino communities speaking on that call who have really good ideas. So I thought this one would be a good one that someone might be interested in. And this is coming up October 15th. Next slide. Another webinar, I think. Yeah. So this is Mathematica. So new insights into disability beneficiaries' pursuit of work. This is one that was, it's on 3 different studies funded by SSA on work activity. One has to do with the impacts of the Great Recession. One has to do with changes in the characteristics in work activities. And one is the likelihood of SSDI beneficiaries receiving overpayments and affecting work activity. We talk a lot about, and there's certainly a lot of focus in Congress and in other places in research. And we had someone from Promise, and I worked some on the Promise project, about SSI and SSDI beneficiaries. How can we help in work? How can we help in the pursuit of work? How can we help do a better job of helping them find work? And with the ultimate goal of perhaps getting off that SSI, SSDI. And so these were 3 interesting ones that I thought would tie into that. Again, from a policy point of view, there was some interesting data in there that I'm certainly going to be using in the future around some of the conversation on Promise. Next slide. I couldn't let us get off the phone without talking a minute about voting. So first of all, to everyone on this call, go vote. The election in November, go vote. It's important. Encourage the folks that you serve to go vote. AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities, has a really good website with a lot of materials for their Rev Up campaign. It's Register, Educate, Vote. And there's lots of resources. There's lots of toolkits and issue guides, and the accessibility toolkit is really well done. There's a lot of data. There is at least some data out there that shows that the disability community does not vote in very large numbers, at least not in the large numbers that we could. Of course, across the country, that's true with everyone as well. This provides some opportunities And I think this election, I don't care where you are, which side of the fence you're on, or if you're in the middle, walking the fence line, there are a lot of issues out there right now that affect the disability community. There are a lot of reasons for people to vote and make your choice known, beyond whether it is because you have an issue or just because it's to say, I'm a person with a disability and I vote. My friend Liz Weintraub, who we've interviewed on here before and who testified before Congress a few weeks ago, Liz talks a lot about the importance of voting and about nothing about us without us. If we don't vote, then we have a better shot of having something happen without us. Put in the positive, if we do vote, there's a lot more chance that things will happen with us, with the community, with people with disabilities included. So that's my little soapbox for today, but I gotta say, that one's really important. Go vote. Next slide. This is smooth. Oh, no, it isn't. Last slide of mine. Can't miss this one either. Save the date, Employment Policy and Measurement, the Rehab Research and Training Center, State of the Science, February 12th, here in DC. Registration's open. The link is there. I will be there. Lots of folks who have been on this call and are on this call regularly will be there. Again, the policy geek in me, I always talk about, there are statistics, and statistics shape policy. They not only should, but I really believe they do. And I think being there and understanding how they do will give us an even better chance in the future of being able to shape policy and practice by using the statistics. You can't just go with smoke and mirrors to the Hill anymore. You can't just go with smoke and mirrors anymore to the agencies. You have to be able to show what the data is. And so y'all come. Okay, next slide. That was my last one. I get to introduce Sally Rogers, so I'm really excited about that. And then I'm going to toss it to her. Sally is the Executive Director and Research Professor at the Center for Psychiatric Rehab at Boston University. She has been conducting research in the mental health and disability fields for many years. Her work focuses on the recovery, vocational success, and well-being of individuals with psychiatric disabilities. Today, Sally's describing the state of vocational services in the U.S. for individuals with psychiatric disabilities and how the field has changed in the last couple of decades. I also want to say that Sally is the first of 3 months where we are going to be looking at these kinds of vocational experiences for people with psychiatric disabilities. I think this is going to be, and Sally's kind of laying the baseline for the next 2 months, where we will be looking more specifically at some specific programs that are working out there and addressing specific populations. So Sally, I am going to toss it to you. Thank you.
Okay, I think that I lost my my audio connection. Can you hear me okay?
You're breaking up some, but
okay. So I'm gonna try to dial in again because somehow I lost my connection. I apologize.
Okay. So she's calling in again. I'm going to encourage all of you to, again, take the poll, send us information about what you'd like to see and hear from us in the future. I'm also going to encourage you to, there's a poll at the end, which we will also be asking you to take, which will ask you which pieces or all pieces of this series that you like or that you appreciate or whatever. So maybe I'll take a second and explain to you what those are until we hear Sally's voice.
I see okay now, whenever you're ready.
Go for it, you can go.
Okay. Somehow my video has been hidden by the who's ever in control, which is totally fine. So you can advance to the next slide. As you mentioned, I am the Executive Director of the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation. If I were with all of you in person, I would ask how many of you have ever heard of the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation, but since I can't do that, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview. Next slide. So the center was the first of the research and training center mechanisms funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, sometimes known as NTIDE. Okay, I'm going to start my video. We were first funded in 1979, and we have been really fortunate to have funding for the last 39 years. Next year will be 40 years, and we're hoping to be able to reapply to continue our work. We think we've been very important in the field, and so we want to continue being a research and training center. I think if we look a little bit to the past, we can see that individuals with psychiatric disabilities, as with many other disabilities, were considered to only have a downward trajectory, and people were told over and over again when they received their psychiatric diagnosis, you'll never get better, learn to live with it, you'll never work, this will be your life. And so our founding concept was that, like other individuals with disabilities, individuals with psychiatric conditions could benefit from rehabilitation services. Believe it or not, when the center was founded by Bill Anthony in 1979, that really was not the prevailing thought. People with mental illness were somehow different. They could not benefit from rehabilitation services. We convinced NTIDE that that was not true. And with this mission, which has essentially remained the same over these almost 40 years, the idea was to help individuals grow beyond the devastating effects of being diagnosed with a psychiatric condition, to have meaningful lives in the community, and to assume valued roles such as those of worker, family member, student, and citizen. Next slide. So some of our guiding principles and values, I think these hold true across a lot of centers of excellence and centers like ours. But we are charged with conducting rigorous, innovative research, projects and evaluations to test and inform new interventions to help people with psychiatric disabilities. Right now, a lot of our focus is on employment interventions and vocational outcomes, but we've really looked at the breadth of recovery in general. We conduct all research, training, and services with respect to the individual and their choices, using participatory methods as much as possible. So that means involving individuals with a lived experience and other stakeholders in all phases of our work. So we have quite a few individuals working as researchers who are people with a lived experience. We like to develop and translate research and expert-based knowledge using innovative methods in partnership with multiple stakeholders. So we have a significant amount of knowledge translation activities that are going on. And we develop systematic approaches in partnership with those multiple stakeholders to embed new practices that are recovery-oriented in mental health programs. Next slide. Some of the major trends that have affected our work, if I look back over the last 30 years or so, these are kind of important transitions that have occurred or are occurring in other disability areas, but they're worth mentioning. The first paradigm shift was really from this idea that you'll never get better, your illness will only get worse, you'll never be able to work. People were allowed to move into the communities, but the idea was we need to just stabilize and maintain. We don't need to talk to people about recovery. We don't need to talk about resuming valued roles. That's for somewhere and someone else, some other group. We're going to focus on stabilization and maintenance. And the field has really changed dramatically in the last 20 years to open up the notion of recovery in all of its aspects. The second major focus, and this may be one that you're very familiar with, was the idea that what we were offering people in the 80s and before that were things like sheltered workshops and group homes. So there were segregated, specialized programs. And so that paradigm began to flip in the 80s and 90s for us as well. So now we talk about supported employment, supported housing, and supported education. So essentially, moving, if you take the supported employment and supported education ideas, moving from a linear train then place to place and then train. So we recognize that individuals could live, learn, work, and socialize in communities of their choice by allowing them access to general programs and then wrapping the supports around them so that they could succeed, rather than having them in segregated and specialized programs. That's the second, I would say, major trend affecting our work. The third is the peer support movement, or the peer movement. which has really had a dramatic impact on what we do. And I think, Denise, you mentioned the nothing about us without us. That has been a really guiding principle for us at the center. Peers and people with a lived experience have great voices in what we do. And in the last, I'd say, 10 to 20 years, they are beginning to assume bigger and bigger roles in the delivery of services. So there are lots of peer support services all over the country, and that's growing. Individuals are being trained to deliver certain kinds of services within the mental health system. And there's just much more recognition of the power of individuals with a lived experience and what they have to give to the mental health system and to support other individuals. Next slide. So just to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit for our vocational initiatives, which, as I mentioned, our last two research and training centers have focused on vocational rehabilitation and supported employment. And so I like to think that we're taking a somewhat innovative approach to supported employment, and I'll describe that. But first, kind of laying the base. Supported employment really began in the 80s for us as a generic term that had to do with the place and train approach. There wasn't at that time an evidence-based practice. We conducted one of the first supported employment studies that was really just a kind of a pre-post evaluation of the approach in the 80s. And then since then, evidence-based supported employment has begun to refer to a particular model called the individual placement and support model. That research has been done by folks who were at Dartmouth and now at WestStat, whose names may be familiar to you, Bob Drake, Gary Bond, and Debbie Becker. So now there are dozens of randomized trials that have been conducted on IPS, both nationally and internationally, all suggesting that IPS performs better than any control condition. So pretty compelling evidence for policymakers making decisions about what kinds of services to support. Some cost-effectiveness studies suggest that employment can have additional benefits. I think you mentioned before, Denise, with the effect of employment on health or something related to that. Some of these studies do suggest that being employed helps to reduce some healthcare costs, and so you would think that better health is also ensuing. IPS studies have really now, or IPS as a model has now gone internationally to Europe and Australia. Next slide, as well as other places. So these are the principles of IPS. I won't go through them in great detail, but these essentially guide the individual placement and support model. It really did turn that kind of sheltered workshop or even clubhouse model. Like the clubhouses were a place where people could go during the day and so-called get ready for work. I'm putting air quotes around that. And so IPS really said anyone who's interested in working is eligible for employment services right away. There's a kind of zero denial policy, and that these services should be integrated with the mental health system and not set aside so that we can achieve better outcomes, and that we should really be striving for competitive employment, mindful about benefits and how they can be affected, and that they should start rapidly, that we shouldn't engage in this long process of readiness development. Support should be continuous, and of course, client preferences should be honored. Next slide. However, the challenges for the field, and a lot of what we base our proposals for research around, is the fact that IPS, while it outdoes control, condition, vocational rehabilitation services in general in every study, still does not lead to what we would call decent work. So the majority of individuals who get employed through all of these 18 or 20 randomized control studies are in dead-end jobs with no benefits and generally minimum wage, often temporary jobs like bell ringer for Salvation Army. So we think that there's a long way to go, and that we really haven't reached the logical conclusion of how we can improve vocational rehabilitation services. So even beyond that, there was a very large mental health treatment study, and this was done with SSDI recipients who were receiving disability benefits because of a psychiatric disability. that even though those experimental folks in that study received evidence-based supported employment and psychotropic medications or psychopharmacological treatment, they still did not engage in employment at a level that would allow them to leave the disability roles. So while supported employment definitely demonstrates benefits in terms of what we used to do, we are still not there yet, and we certainly haven't been able to bend the curve so that people feel comfortable going off the disability roles. The other problem is that supported employment services are not yet widely available for people with psychiatric disability. Some estimates are that only a small percentage, like 4% of individuals who want employment services actually get them. And then the last point is that we believe that new enhancements and innovations are needed to this supported employment model that we've developed now about 20 or so years ago. We still need to think about how do we innovate, how do we change our approach and those principles to make things yield better outcomes for the people that we work with. Next slide. In addition to the 18 to 20 randomized trials that I mentioned on IPS, there are also large-scale Social Security investigations that have been conducted to improve employment outcomes. Most, however, have demonstrated that it's very difficult to get people to a place of gainful employment where they feel comfortable leaving the roles. I did mention that mental health treatment study. But what they actually found in that is over a 2-year period, the people who got IPS or evidence-based supported employment only earned about $800 to $1,200 more than the control condition that didn't get employment services. So that's over a 2-year period. So certainly maybe about $10 a week. That's not enough to make a difference to allow people to live more meaningful lives in the community or consider going off the benefits. Next slide. Part of the problem with the Social Security demonstration projects I'll mention is getting people to be willing to participate in some of these studies. That has been a recurring problem. In the mental health treatment study that I mentioned, they recruited individuals with psychiatric disabilities who were on SSDI and who met some other criteria, but they only got 14% of the population that they tried to recruit agreeing to be part of the study. So it's very hard to do a Social Security study that tries to target individuals who are on disability because people are fearful about their benefits. So now they're actually focusing on individuals who've recently been rejected from disability benefits. So with that as a backdrop, a little bit more about what the center has been about in the last 10 years. As I mentioned, our focus has been on employment quite a bit. So we are in the throes of or have completed several clinical trials of employment-related interventions, all of them designed to fill existing gaps in vocational services. So randomized trials have really become the gold standard for us. We don't think we can get a research and training center funded without conducting randomized studies, which of course comes with some difficulties. Having to randomize people to get a new intervention or not can sometimes be difficult from a human perspective. But the goal is really to test various cognitive and peer-led and other innovations to supported employment. We've also done things like secondary analyses of existing data sets to better understand predictors of employment success for this population. And we've looked at some policy studies about adopting supported employment. Next slide. Next slide whenever you're ready. Thank you. So just to give you a little bit of a feeling for the kinds of things that we're doing around employment, there is an evidence-based intervention called Illness Management and Recovery. It was developed by someone who's at the center, Kim Muser, being used in a lot of mental health programs nationally, and it's basically a psychoeducational approach to teaching people about their illness and about how best to cope with their illness. We proposed and then conducted a randomized trial where we took illness management and recovery as our basic evidence-based intervention, and we infused it with the things that we thought people would need, skills and knowledge, to better function in a vocational setting. So the idea was to help people with their symptoms and their functioning once they got onto a job, and to hope that they would cope better. So that's one example of a randomized trial that we recently completed. The second one is called Vocational Empowerment Photo Voice, and at the end I have a little example I'll show you from that study. The idea here was that IPS appeals to people who can articulate a desire to work. But what about people who've given up on that? What about people who don't have a vocational identity? So we decided to develop an intervention using this methodology called Photo Voice, and to target individuals who really don't feel like they can enter the workforce even with help and support, and to get them to reconsider that and to empower them to think about themselves as a vocational being. That is also we're also conducting a randomized trial on that as well. Another intervention that we conducted a randomized trial on is something called vocational peer support. So we took trained, certified peer support specialists. We trained them to understand the world of vocational rehabilitation and vocational recovery. And then we randomly assigned individuals who wanted peer support to get peer support from either these specially trained vocational providers or regular peer support specialists, to see if peer support specialists, who a lot of times say, I don't know how to support people relative to looking for work or getting work or being in a job, to train them and see if the outcomes were better for those people who got vocational peer support. The last one is one that we're just wrapping up now. It's a randomized study of an intervention we call opening doors. The idea here was that IPS really focuses on getting people into lower level, entry level jobs without benefits, et cetera. But we know our population, there are a lot of people who have advanced degrees or had aspirations for advanced degrees or AA degrees, but the illness interrupted their pursuit of that goal. So opening doors is really designed to open up this conversation about what kind of career did I want? Is it possible for me to recapture those goals, to work on those goals again, or to modify them in some way that doesn't mean a job tomorrow at the car wash, but really focus on something more long-term. That intervention was done at the center and was very well received by the participants. So we're in the middle now of analyzing the data to see how it's working. Next slide. A couple of other variations of supported employment have started to crop up. One of the most important ones recently was this huge study that was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. I think something like 18 clinics around the country provided a multimodal care to young adults who were experiencing their first episode of psychosis. Embedded in that was a supported employment and supported education intervention designed to see whether they could improve employment outcomes for individuals experiencing their first episode of psychosis. It looks as though they were able to raise employment rates slightly, but had no effect on educational outcomes. Another supported employment approach called On Track New York, similar to the first bullet, designed to focus on first episode, which is really a growing interest in our field, working with people who are young adults having their first episode of psychosis. The third one is employment collaboratives, which some of you may know about, that are functioning here in the state of Massachusetts, designed to do a better job of job development and placement than the IPS model is currently able to do. So it's really an enhancement, job development and placement. And then progressive employment, which is, I would say, is a bit contrary to IPS principles. I wouldn't say it's very contrary to IPS principles, because the idea is that wherever a person is able to engage with the workforce, that's acceptable, and that includes non-competitive employment. IPS focuses only on competitive employment. Next slide. So this is just an example of Photo Voice. I mentioned earlier that we're doing quite a bit with Photo Voice at the center, and have decided that vocational empowerment is one of the ways in which Photo Voice can be very exciting. So the idea with Photo Voice is that it was a methodology that was originally developed as a public health tool to go into indigenous and third world countries and to provide cameras to individuals and to have them use the camera to tell their story, whatever that story is about. In this case, what we said to people is, we want you to to talk about your vocational empowerment or your vocational history in photographs, and then to create a narrative that goes along with that photograph. So this is an example of someone who chose this wooden doll and says, my picture is of a wooden carved statue of a woman feeling successful. Her arms are extended straight up in the air. She's rejoicing in her success and finally founding herself. When I saw this statue in my cabinet at home, I immediately knew it was the picture I had to write about. This is me today. I have found myself, my career goals, who I am. It has all come together after many years of severe mental illness. Today I feel joy, success, happiness, and love like never before. So this is an example of how photo voice can be used to get people to really visualize and talk about whatever painful vocational experiences they've had. And many people have had such disruptions in their life around work and school that it can be a very painful topic. On the other hand, when they have successes, it can also be a cause for rejoicing, as it is in this photograph. Next slide. So just in summary, to kind of take the long view about where we are with employment in particular for people with mental illness, I would say that significant strides have been made when I think back to what I was offering when I was a vocational rehab counselor, and I had a man who had a law degree and then developed a severe mental illness, and all I was able to offer him was a shelter workshop. So things have changed dramatically since then, and thank goodness for that. So now the focus is really on mainstream, integrated, competitive employment. But the services that are available and accessible are uneven throughout the country, and even within one state, they're uneven. And most individuals who engage in evidence-based supported employment do not achieve what we would call decent work. That is a real connection to the workforce that's permanent, that involves benefits. So most people are in dead-end, low-level jobs, minimum wage primarily. And we believe that new innovations are needed. They need to be developed, they need to be tested, also advance employment services and make them more accessible to individuals. And that includes individuals who are on the continuum of vocational recovery, not just those who have already said, I want to work, but those who might be thinking about work or considering work, and to try to move those individuals along the continuum. I think I'll stop there and see. I don't know if you have a mechanism for people asking questions, but I can certainly answer any questions that people might have.
Thanks so much, Sally. We do have a couple of questions for you. First,
Okay.
asking, what is your experience with IPS and wraparound support services? The Kessler Foundation has a pilot project using this model in Kansas.
Okay, I'm actually not familiar with that initiative.
Okay.
I think we don't tend to use the term wraparound services quite as much, but IPS is very strongly focused on integrating vocational and mental health services. So to some extent, those mental health services are really designed to wrap around the person. So housing, medical treatment, mental health treatment, case management, all need to be in place and working so that the person can really get the best out of IPS, get the most out of IPS. But I'm not familiar with the Kansas project.
Okay, thank you. We have a second question asking if the WIOA regulations are reopened so that the definition of competitive integrated employment could be changed. What is your or BU Center for Psych Rehab's position on what the definition should be?
We do discuss and argue, I guess, a little bit about what is competitive employment. I think that the existing definition of a job that's not owned by a mental health program, that's in the mainstream, where there's at least a minimum wage, and where an individual is working with other non-disabled individuals is adequate for that definition. I think that we should consider that competitive employment, while that may be the ultimate goal, that there are times when other things like unpaid internships can be very valuable And IPS tends to exclude those opportunities and really focus on competitive employment. And I think sometimes that actually lands up being hurtful to the person's long-term goals, especially for career goals. So in Opening Doors, we have a lot of people who wanted to do an unpaid internship in pursuit of a career goal. That would not be something that IPS would really support. So we like the idea of progressive employment notion.
Can I jump in for 1 second, Deb, just to be clear? This is Denise. I just want to be clear that in talking about whether or not the real regs get opened, AUCD has a position that we do not want the regs opened, that they are, we've only had them in place for a couple of years. WIO itself is relatively new. We are still trying to test out how they work and what that means, and that we should give it more time to see. Beyond that, we also believe strongly in competitive integrated employment. So I didn't, in talking about it this time, I think I've said that before in the past, but in talking about it this month, I didn't say that. So let me just be real clear. We've got, and again, if it's something you're interested in, there is information up on AUCD's website. And if in fact they open, we will be doing draft comments, and you can look at those and take those that you agree with or not, whatever. But we will do draft comments and have those available for the field.
Okay, one more question, and then we need to do our wrap up and our poll. Sally, two different people are asking if there's a good resource for statistics on types of competitive integrated employment people with psychiatric disabilities are obtaining by educational attainment.
Unfortunately, there aren't good statistics. We're actually going to be holding our State of the Science meeting on November 7th, and somebody from your shop, Eric Lauer, is going to be helping us understand why there aren't better numbers. There are so many definitional problems, and there are problems with different federal institutes not able to share data. But I would say there are not good statistics on educational level and its relation to employment. We do know a large number of people have educational disruptions and never go back to complete their degrees. Very, very large percentages, but beyond that, we don't have too much good data, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Sally. So, reminder, we have a survey that you can complete to tell us what you think about the nTIDE, as well as a final poll that we'd like to share. Again, if you're on Facebook Live, you can just use the chat function. Our question is, which section of the nTIDE do you find most interesting? The overview of the National Trends in Disability Employment Jobs Report release, news from the field, guest panelists, interviewees, although we didn't have one today, and then the question and answer period. So we'll leave that up. I think we have 1 minute, and we'll be close to 1 o'clock at that point, and we'll close the poll and do our conclusion. Okay, thank you everyone who participated in the poll. It looks like news from the field had the most votes, followed by guest panelists. Next slide, please.